Welcome to our Plus Ultra Collective Workshop with Dr. Stephen Pink on the Scriptome. Dr. Pink, if you would get us started.
Sure. Shall I go back a little? And I was saying that this idea of a scriptome begins with the intuition that the written world can be mapped as a system. So I'm not talking primarily about geography, although that's part of it, but concepts, materials, the entire interrelation. The big influence for me was this book by L.T. Buehring that came out in 2011, Medieval Manuscript Production in the Latin West. And he used statistics. He's actually primarily an economist, or he started out as an economist before moving into medieval studies. And he applied statistics to a small data set of manuscript records to infer outline numbers for total production in the Latin West from the 6th to the 15th century, with some further breakdowns by sort of manuscript type, chronology, and so on. And he inferred, albeit with major caveats as to what a manuscript is, around 11 million manuscripts produced in total, of which we have only 750,000, so well under 10%. And he extended that in a cursory fashion to the rest of the old world. So he saw perhaps 3 million surviving manuscripts as far afield as Ethiopia and India between the 1st and the 19th century. So he was obviously building on people who'd come before. A very important source and influence for him was Neil Kerr and his medieval libraries of Great Britain. But nonetheless, it was a really big leap in terms of method and scale and ambition. And really what struck me most about it was not so much the precision, but this quest for completeness. You know, he was a bit like Aristophanes, who attempted to infer the size of the earth by measuring its curvature. And also the possibility of turning a book like this into a blueprint for a machine, a system that's capable of continuously inferring the unseen totality of old world manuscripts. And so this project is really my attempt to build such a system. And you know, I'd have to say this is really far from an original idea. A really obvious precedent would be something like Google Earth, which stitched together billions of fragments into a system that feels whole, albeit with massive inference. And the term scriptome itself, I borrowed from genetics. I don't see why they should have a monopoly on that term, where it describes, or rather the transcriptome, it describes a sort of stage in the journey of our genes from the genome to building the whole organism. So it's kind of actually an apt analogy, but I won't labor it. And of course, what there wasn't when Buehring was writing was the data. But since 2011, the quantity and accessibility of that data has exploded. And as it explodes, so is the need for an interrogable, navigable model. And, you know, even so, until very recently, a project of this scale basically would have demanded an entire institution. You know, you need programmers as well as researchers, an entire infrastructure. And large multimodal models have really changed that completely. I mean, they are inference engines, and they seem born to perform what is, after all, a foundational act of inference on the pre-modern. So in this talk, I'm really going to focus not about the finished scriptome, which is just a very, very long way off, but learning through the process. So how working with LLMs reshapes the act of modeling itself, and how it allows an individual researcher to really scale up. If Buring was the blueprint, I suppose Drupal for me was the means, at least in the first instance. The choice was sort of potluck. I think I have a 10-year history with Drupal, having built a few fairly complex websites with it. Let me just pause briefly to explain what Drupal is. You're scratching your head. So you probably know, doubtless, WordPress. So this is a website building system known as a content management system. It lets you create public pages on the web that can do quite complex things. Creators mainly work with it via a website interface, but under the hood, you have a server, a database, you have the core code, you have various plugin modules that manipulate that data and alter the public-facing pages. So it's a crude analogy, but if WordPress is Lego, then I'd say Drupal is sort of Meccano. It's a bit more intricate, more demanding, but you can do a lot more with it. And sort of up till 2016, which I'd say was the sort of peak for it, it built up a really big ecosystem of modules, some of them contributed by big budget organizations like the WHO and the White House for free. It's been very well documented for academic use by institutions like Stanford. So it means someone who isn't a full-time programmer can come along and construct sophisticated systems. So really someone like me. So, you know, this is an example of a website search engine that was constructed in Drupal. There are the kind of fields that you would build up generally through the front-facing public interface for your database. So what's changed completely with large language models, not least, is the workflow. So they can manipulate the database underneath Drupal directly. They can even write modules from scratch with high accuracy. And this is all based ultimately on your verbal or your written prompt in natural English, which it then executes via the command line interface or services like GitHub. Sorry, so that is a command line interface on a server, which is how I work. And of course, you could do all this before, but it might take hours or even days to debug a module, to clean a large data set. And, you know, I'm not much of a programmer. I go slowly when I do this stuff. So these models can do that kind of stuff in seconds. And already, I'd say, versus the old way, it's amounted to man years, person years of time saved. So my typical routine is pretty simple. It's not the only routine, and I'll come on to that later. So I describe what I want in plain language using ChatGPT chat window, for example, like the one up there. So say, write a script to delete this field, rebuild it like this, or rethink all the nodes of this type. It generates the code, PHP. I paste it into the command line interface on my server. I run it. I paste back the output, including errors. It revises it. I rerun. We reiterate until the job is done. And because ChatGPT has a context window, it has a memory of everything we've discussed within our ongoing project. It retains all the knowledge it needs of the database structure, the passwords, it needs to get into the database, everything. And it will also learn from previous mistakes. I should say there are ways to cut out this copying and pasting. You can use services like ChatGPT, Codex, but I prefer it this way. It gives me more control. So this isn't a free lunch. If you don't know what you're asking for, it will happily go round in circles. And I've certainly done that, even though those circles are quite useful for thinking things through. And indeed, it helps with that thinking. It would be intellectually dishonest to suggest that it doesn't. But overall, I think there's been a kind of reallocation of expertise. The key is that I, the creator, I imagine and I express the intellectual model of the project. So the taxonomy, the fields, the relationships I want, and it will handle the dirty work in PHP, in Python, or whatever language the task demands. And again, looking at the slow take-up of some of the contributed Drupal AI module, which would let you manipulate it through the Drupal web pages, I think that's how other people are now integrating AI with content management systems like Drupal. So they're going past the old interfaces. I just wanted to, and this will be the most detailed section, just look at a proof of concept, which is the statistic calculator that I built using ChatGPT. It more or less wrote it. So this is really the moment when I begin to turn the website into an inference process rather than just a filing cabinet. The aim was pretty simple. Let's take the mathematical relationships inside Buring's text and let's make them executable inside Drupal, and then let's make them potentially applicable beyond his original data set. So as you may know, his text didn't only give totals, he provided sets of correction factors, regional multipliers that allowed him to, let's see if I can go back and find it, that allowed him to derive those figures from source data. So CARES, MLGB, all sorts of economic statistics, but basically all the key tables in his book rest on a handful of equations linking 3 or 4 kinds of number. So our first task, or what I wanted to do as a test, was just to reverse engineer those. And here the LMM proved really unexpectedly adept. I don't know whether I should do this, but I gave it the full text to read. It deletes the text after a while. So it's about 300 pages. I asked it to extract every explicit or implicit formula. Within minutes, it had sort of pulled out and standardized the expressions for each stage in his reasoning chain. We then took those equations and we embodied them as taxonomy terms in Drupal, one for each statistic type. And again, I would have to say large language models are very useful for working out the basic database structure for a very large project, which after all will have to assimilate all the manuscript data eventually that there is out there. So this meant that every node of the manuscript data, whether it's Latin West, the 15th century Armenia, the 8th century, whatever, could reference the relevant formulae through its through the necessary relational field. So next came building the module itself, and really through chat, as you know, my project already has a full knowledge of the Drupal project structure that it's built up, passwords, where the folders are, and and so on. And so really I described what I needed in plain language. So you're going to, the module will accept a statistic. It will look up the nodes that use that statistic by place and period. It will read the formula, it will evaluate it, and it will write the result back for that particular node in a calculated value field. So, you know, it went ahead, it generated a full module, all of the scaffolding, the calculation engine itself. There's just the sort of screenshot there, the error handling, the hooks, you need to expand it. And I then copy and paste it all into my Drupal project. Inevitably, you know, that didn't work. There's a slide just illustrating a moment of frustration. But then I pasted the errors into chat, it diagnosed and rewrote, and after a few loops, the service was functional and could be reproduced. And once running, it actually began to reproduce Buring's own published results by rederiving them from the data and the formulas the model had extracted from the book. And here this is just a screenshot showing a table, a particular statistic type. The value means Buring's original value, and there is the calculated value. And so it was getting extremely close to the calculated value, give or take some rounding errors, which I guess is because I'm working off Buring's presented data and not the internal data in his spreadsheet. So we'd effectively rebuilt that independently, and because every element is stored as a Drupal entity, the whole chain of reasoning is visible, and then potentially applicable beyond it. And this was really just a proof of concept. It created a very important, useful workflow, feedback loop involving the humans, Drupal, the large language models as a way for proceeding. So, of course, this calculator is just one example of what we now use, and now use large language models to do. I've used it to do a bunch of other stuff. For example, data visualizations. Sorry, this is just very crude. This is a demos style projection of Planet Buring, if you like. So before, you know, this is a real pain to do, to produce something that will just consistently work. You have to get the JSON data that these visualizers feed on properly formatted, or it will crash. You have to import the right libraries. So it will do all that. It will write the module, and you know, there's a bit of trial and error, but overall vastly faster than I ever could have. And we've actually generated, you know, dozens upon dozens of scripts, various other tasks this way that can be reused. But really, I'm just going to focus on one other thing, which is the main challenge right now, which is assembling everything accessible online about pre-modern writing, setting up a framework that we can revisit, so that we can go back and scan changes in those sources automatically. So you'll remember that Buring relies heavily on Kerr's Medieval Libraries of Great Britain, both the book and the wonderful MLGB3 database. That database, by the way, is currently being retooled, and I look forward to seeing what comes out. So using a very similar workflow from before, the LMM did the heavy lifting. It extracted static copies of all the MLGB3 data from Wayback Machine, because the database isn't currently accessible. It cleaned and normalized the data for import. It designed, in a conversation with me, the sort of database structures and fields that are robust enough to hold both MLGB3 and future sources, and then it imported and it cross-referenced the data inside the Scriptomes project, meaning that I could actually then recompute Buring's results directly from those sources, not just from his printed summaries of those sources. And from there, we moved on to some other accessible aggregations of manuscript data, really as a learning process and as a way of fleshing out the database structure. So the digital scriptorium, for example, which is an aggregation of manuscripts held in libraries in the United States, and it folds in Will Knoll's marvelous, the late Will Knoll's marvelous Schoenberg manuscript database now. And of course, we took in not only the raw data, but the classifications that come with it, the authors, the themes, the subjects, a kind of ready-made taxonomy that we could then use as a basis for our own. This really brings me on to the next stage. Now you use large multimodal models, large language models, and their real promise, not obviously as mere generators of code that manipulates data, but as direct interpreters of that data using their own vast internal weightings. So in other words, they're directly performing the inference, although of course they've been performing inference all along while generating the code too. So I use this already in a kind of narrow fashion, but heavily, for example, in categorizing terms I've brought in. Because ChatGPT window has limits about the amount of data you can put in, it will give out. It can't classify 10,000 strings at once. It would give you something you don't want, which is a Python script to do it. So to scale up, you have to use the ChatGPT or large language model API or application programming interface. So I don't know if you use this, but the nuts and bolts, you open an API account, you buy a bundle of tokens, as they call them. The people like ChatGPT charge a few cents for a few thousand strings of text, or tens of thousands, depending on the model, and you receive the process results in return. You get a unique key to access the service. But as before, the chat window will actually generate the small amount of Python or PHP, the script you need to call that API and act on your database. And again, that's why I think the take-up of AI modules written for the front end of Drupal isn't taking off, because people are just, it's easier just to make your own. And so, you know, that simple step, shifting from the window to the API loop, opens the door to, you know, large scale inference. So for example, I've used it to classify, I'm sorry that's so small, that text, but to just strip out of a bunch of undifferentiated terms, what's a person, what's a place, you know, what's a date, so that I can use that more usefully, and to associate terms with sort of individuals, and so on and so forth. Where do you go from here? I won't dwell too much on, there are some very big practical challenges coming up that I'm currently dealing with as I move away from sort of low-hanging fruit, like these aggregations of data, or, you know, some really excellent library records, to records, I have to say, inevitably very often further from Europe, whether it's North Africa, whether it's Central Asia, whether it's East Asia, where they're actually doing the same sort of work. It's a parallel universe, but it's it's harder to access. So, you know, but in any case, you're suddenly dealing with non-standard formats, inconsistent metadata, less accessible data in the first place, which only goes to highlight just how partial our current map is of old world production. The obvious next step is towards agents. So these are autonomous LLM processes that harvest data, classify it, do whatever you want, needing little human prodding. Although it always sounds very futuristic, it really is the present now. Companies such as Structify are already offering this as a service to people who don't want to perhaps get their hands dirty, although really what they're doing is very little. They're really just marrying up, as far as I can tell, you know, scripts that you know, a bit of Python or whatever. It accesses the service, the large language model service, using an API, and it takes in an input from somewhere in its chain and outputs it to somewhere else in its chain. So in plain English, a kind of background worker. It wakes every few hours, it runs its prompt, it checks for change, it updates the model, it moves the data on somewhere else in the chain. But I'd say this is really where I see it going: a self-updating system, one that scans, harvests, classifies, recalculates, validates, infers even on its own, with every decision remaining logged and reviewable. And this really, sort of in conclusion, brings me to what I think the scriptome becomes next, namely, apologize for the proliferation of terms, but an inferome, as it were, the totality of everything that one might infer about the pre-modern. And really, over time, it's become clear that this project is not just or even primarily a database, but a base experiment in pre-modern inference studies and how our knowledge itself is going to be rebuilt. And this really, to me, looks like the future of pre-modern scholarship. One can imagine these models, almost left to themselves, will eventually themselves infer the entire corpus of, you know, whatever's been scratched or written, otherwise inscribed, extant and destroyed, and then build disciplines upon it. So you might ask, why bother with the Scriptomes project at all? And certainly many, perhaps all of the interfaces I've shown you here, the skills, bar one, will soon feel quaint. They'll be like the Tin Lizzy phase of the journey. Perhaps in a few years, perhaps in a few months, I think we'll say to an LLM, build me a complex website, build me a relational database, a model of these relationships, and it will do it. And I'm sure the crucial skill then will be conceptual, narrative, symbolism, precision of description on the part of the creator, and not low-level programming, which will become increasingly transparent and invisible. But this is really the point, because the data, the raw data available for talking about the pre-modern is dreadful. Most of the record is destroyed, and much of what survives, you know, a mere fraction, is itself inaccessible to large language models, large multimodal models. If it's been scanned and only photographed, and only a fraction of that it's in images that it can perhaps say interesting things about, but it can't read directly. A lot of the best scholarship, the best editions, they're trapped behind paywalls. I know there is stuff going on, you hear it all the time, that we're you talk to a publisher or you talk to a large project and they say, oh, we're working as a data partner with these companies. So you know that there's something going on. But this is something that's not actually going to cure itself. We need a huge push to digitize what we have and make it available to them. And above all, what you then need is a context map, a model of what we don't know. Because without that, you'll have an immensely distorted picture that these things will almost automatically begin producing. It's very seductive, it's very easy to access, you know, and so on. So that's really what I see Scriptomes doing. It's a sort of foundation in the first instance to give humans and machines a structured awareness of gaps, biases, absences in the archive. It's a corrective instrument. And I believe this is a really important thing for further progress in any study built upon LMMs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pink. And I think you had one last slide, right? Introducing the
conference. Oh, yes, I did. And I was just going to say that, and apologies for the size, and also the registration link isn't up yet, but Roger, I think, might have the right one. So we'll be exploring all these questions at our conference, ours and many more. Ours in Querendi, Querying the Pre-Modern in the Age of Large Multimodal Models, which will be online from the 4th to the 7th of December. We have some wonderful keynotes, Roger among them. We'll be discussing simulation and thinking, these rather exciting emergent properties of models. We have Maurizio Forte, who'll be talking about the use of LLMs in archaeology and in the visual and visual affect. And that's really a huge topic, because when it comes down to it, the visual is what we have in the pre-modern and it can't read it. So that's going to be very interesting. And we will be revisiting the idea of large language models as the archive and their insufficiencies. And we have a whole bunch more. We have pre-modernists using it. We have some technologists coming along, all sorts of people. So please do come on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And if I can ask you to close or stop sharing your presentation now. Great.
Stop sharing.
Just so we'll have this. So the first thing I kind of wanted to do, and I am going to open this up to questions right away, which is, I kind of have a question to everybody in the room, which is, and I put this in the chat so you can see it. So the question is, API, GitHub, Drupal, what is all this stuff? So I would ask you, using inside the Google tools where you can raise your hand if you're completely or somewhat intimidated by the prospect of doing this sort of work yourself. Raise your hand if you feel that way. Okay, that's great. This is actually the ideal kind of thing, right? Which is you can lower your hands now. I think the point is, and I think what Stephen is showing us, is that we don't actually necessarily need to know how to do some of these things. With LLMs and AI models, if you can craft the concept and the question in the way that Stephen has done, which is, all right, I want to take these equations that Van Buren put together to better understand what has been lost. Can you help me? Can you help me design a process for doing that and implementing it? And very much so in the same way what Stephen is doing is that you can go through this iterative process back and forth with the chat to kind of build to not only train yourself, what do these things do, not completely understanding what they do, and almost in like a medieval magic that it looks like, but then to actually kind of test those ideas. So I think all of us should be actually incredibly intimidated by this, because it is very new and difficult to understand. But just like in the way that everybody in the room has done all of their own scholarly studies. We all started at some place, and then we accumulated certain levels of expertise and experience to do those things. This is just another place where maybe it's another set of skills or experiences you'd like to develop. So I just wanted to encourage you in that way, not to be intimidated. We're all intimidated. I would like to go ahead and just open up the floor to questions. If you would just raise your hand and then turn on your microphone, and then I'll acknowledge you, and then just go ahead and ask any questions. They also can be comments, and one of the other open questions I will leave is right now on the table is, how do you think you might actually use something like large language models or AI to help you do some type of investigation? It might be just an idea or a concept, but where are you kind of like noodling, thinking, what could I be doing? And I think one of the benefits of a workshop like this, in the 30 minutes that we have, is to actually provide feedback to each other. We have Stephen here who could, offer you comments like, oh, this is a way you might approach that problem. So I'll stop there. So if anyone has any questions, I open the floor to y'all. Yes, Aaron, please.
Hi. So I was curious, when you talked about using the AI to sort of clean up data, how do you validate or sanity check that to make sure that it's cleaning up data and not, inserting data from its own data sets?
Well, in some ways, it is inserting data from its own. I mean, so what I do is, after it's been through, let's say, 10,000 fields, I will cast my eye. This sounds very crude, but I will just cast my eye down all 10,000 outputs, which actually doesn't take as long as you might think, to see where it's sort of missed a place, or where it's missed a person, or misclassified. There is a whole issue here of accuracy and inaccuracy, and how useful is something that is mostly accurate when one tests it, but with inaccuracies, and is it better than nothing at all? There are definitely scopes for errors. The most important thing I've found is the quality of the query, and that really coming back, to what Roger said about skills. The most important thing is being able to write your query as expressively and clearly as you can.
Okay, thank you.
Oops, sorry about that. I'm going to add something to that in just a second. I'll come to you, Andrea, which is sometimes it's really hard to kind of like, okay, how is this really done? And I think you're asking really the right question, Aaron, which is, how do we know ChatGPT is not lying to us and creating stuff out of thin air? And certainly, so, one of these workflows, and I could just show you really quickly how this can work, would be, for instance, where's this one? So one of the projects I'm working on right now is for a historical society in St. Augustine, Florida, and basically looking at a muster roll from the 1500s in Florida. And what's interesting about this one is it has lots of data in it, where I wanted to capture all these different individuals who are in the muster roll. So, the first kind of problem really was trying to decide, how do I want to train the LLM to read this and turn it into a spreadsheet. And so very much so in a kind of in an iterative process, I described to the LLM, okay, so what you're going to see here inside this file is a name, and then a comma or a period that'll eliminate, then it's going to be a role, and then it's going to say where they're from in a city in Spain. And then I actually would just say, okay, read the first line of the PDF and ask it to return that to me, because I want to build my own kind of trust with it. Then I ask it to read 5 lines and then repeat that information back to me. And then I'm correcting along the way, like, oh, you know, a chaplain is a role. But through that process, then we can kind of build a type of understanding that the LLM is fully understanding it, what you're asking it for. And then the next piece that really kind of happens then is you can make the next conceptual leap, which is to asking it to do another type of task, which is, this is the next one, which is, here we go. I'm going to go to this one. And I wanted to show this one where I asked it then, okay, so populate an Excel spreadsheet for me with the name and their title and everything. And then it would start to fill that in for me. And then I would basically check every 5 lines. And as I built a kind of a trust with the system that I felt it was doing this accurately, then I could end up building a large data set that is now, 250 individuals read out of that individual muster roll. So now I know my data is good. This is where, the next step that kind of, and I'm not going to really do too much about this, is what I did next then was I used an AI agent to say, because I was interested in understanding, do any of these families have connections to the Spanish Inquisition, whether they were investigated or they were members of the Inquisition? And I used an AI agent to query a Spanish database to see if there are any records that there were hits. So basically, within about 30 minutes, what the AI had done for me, once I provided it with this kind of information, I was able to evaluate a whole muster roll of about 250 individuals and identify 10% of those are ones that I wanted to look more closely at. And so this is kind of that same approach I think Stephen is getting at, which is kind of inference, which is help me get through all the chaff, right? So I can get to the wheat. And that's where, this can kind of work. But again, I think your question is perfectly timed, which is how do you verify it's not creating, bonkers data, and how we can test it. So maybe that's one way of showing how to do that. But just a thought there. Andrea, I know you had a question or a comment.
Hi, thank you, Stephen. That was a really interesting talk. I'm going to out myself first and say I'm a modernist. So this is really outside of my field of knowledge, but I'm really interested in archives and thinking through critically about archival silences. And I'm wondering how sort of these mathematical formulas that you're building on, are they accounting? They're accounting for absences. How do they or don't they account for absences that are more than simply something got burnt in a fire, or we lost this from some other sort of non-human reason, versus all the human decision-making we know that goes into what's kept and maintained in archives and preserved over time? And so I'm wondering, sort of, is this a model that also looks at the social history of preservation, or can it account for some of that social history of how knowledge is preserved? Or is this more about sort of random absences?
Yeah, so Buring, obviously Buring did this sort of pioneering thing, and yeah, he looked at all sorts of things from outside. He was actually coming from outside, manuscript scholarship in the first instance, and yeah, he looks at all sorts of things, the growth of urban centers and so on, and of course he's attempting generalizations
Mhm.
you know, of rather than the sort of fate of individual manuscript. But yes, and one of the things that really excites me is that if you he's built a kind of inference engine based on what he had, and you can test it. But as you grow the available data, and massive amounts of data have appeared since he wrote that. Although some would argue that actually you don't need that; you just need a high quality small database. But anyway, as the amounts of data have appeared, then you can alter those inferences and expand them, and you can of course test them against if stuff's being scanned and if what we actually know exists. So it's possible to, I sort of see the inference engine being constantly refined and growing, and our sort of picture of what we don't know for sure constantly coming into like sort of terra incognita, sort of shrinking or at least becoming more defined. So yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions that people would like to throw out there? Yes, Anthony, please.
Hello, Stephen. I was wondering how the maths works. If 10% is the basic survival rate of manuscripts, and that would mean that for a single manuscript to survive, on average, you need to have 10 copies. Is there this vast hinterland of low-copied manuscripts which we just can't pick up from the figures?
There may be, and and there are obviously different manuscript types, and because obviously we have this survival bias of trophy manuscripts or high value things versus, I don't know, the scribe's minutes from that meeting. And,
non-monastic stuff.
And he's gone one of the issues with Björing's model, it was sort of an initial model, and he very much clamps down on what I'm going to call a manuscript. It obviously is no way near sort of everything that might be. So it's quite self-consciously very incomplete and provisional. But yeah, I mean, he models that and he comes up with sort of average loss rates and things per century per region. There's sort of local modeling and so on. But yeah, but even just naming that hinterland is putting it there on the map. America. There are the Americas of the unknown there in between. We don't, is just incredibly useful and perspective transforming.
Thanks, Anthony. Other questions that people might have that you might want to throw in, or also, again, how often is it do you have, another dozen colleagues, 16 colleagues in the room with you, and you're sitting in your office and you're not sure how you would actually approach a problem. So if anyone wants to kind of throw out a problem that you've been thinking about, or a project you were thinking about, how you would approach it using some type of technology or a model like this, I encourage you just to throw that idea out. There's no judgment here at all. It's really this is very experimental, and that's what's important, I think, is trying these new ways of doing things. Wonderful. Kobe, please.
So one question I had about the presentation, which I really enjoyed, was about the classification of text as, like, to know whether it's a date or a place.
Mhm.
I'm curious about how you approach that problem and what the performance of the large language models are on that problem.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, so I had a bunch of, what I had was a bunch of data that I'd scraped that, and possibly it was my fault in the way I scraped it, but I don't think it was. It was sort of undifferentiated. So it was like, God knows how much, 250,000 terms, some of it's dates, some of it's people, and all the rest of it. And so the first thing I would do, because it's also cheapest in terms of time and effort, is ChatGPT in a window will write pretty good scripts for crude pattern matching. Like if you have 4 numbers and a dash and another 4 numbers on its own, you can be, you know, it's probably a date. So I did a kind of very crude, rough sorting using basically Python scripts that I just get ChatGPT to generate, and then I look at the outputs. And so then once you've got down to that, I might then also use the API where it's not actually designing a program or a search criteria to filter so much as filtering itself. It's looking into its own I don't want to anthropomorphize it, but into its own interior and just saying, this is what it is according to my weightings. And that's for me the more impressive bit, although it's the bit I sort of came across less in the so basically it won't do everything in one go. I break it down into stages, and I will get it to do some filtering, and then maybe I'll start using the API, which can also take a while for sort of fine tuning. And yeah, I'm impressed. Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks.
okay, thank you. That was
Thank you,
very
Kobe.
clear.
Sorry about that, Kobe. Thanks for the question, Steve, and thanks for helping us think a lot about that. We also have a question from Katie, and she mentions, is it possible to integrate this approach with GIS and mapping visualizations?
Yeah. So yeah, it's possible. One of the really nice things is, so you know, this is all open source software. There are hundreds of thousands of pages of people discussing it, that it's trained on, and all the code, and it will do all the hard work. If you know a visualization engine, so I think I just showed you like Cesium, for example. Let's say I had a bunch of places and I didn't have the latitude and longitude or POSCIS or whatever I need to plot that on a map. I can give it all of those places and it will come back fairly reliably with the data that we need to plot. I can then tell it in the window, I want you to write a module that visualizes this using Cesium or whatever it is, and it more or less will. And that's more or less what I did. I think I showed you very briefly. I literally just plotted these areas of manuscript production that Buren calculated as a kind of map on a sphere. That was really done almost entirely using verbal prompts. So I had to maybe break down the stages a little. You know, you've got to produce a JSON data source or whatever that the visualizer can read, but it did all hard work.
And I went ahead and just pasted into the commentary the Cesium website. Another one that is out there is called NodeGoat, and it's something I'm using right now, which is to go ahead and actually take those muster roll records that I'm looking at and then presenting them in a visualization, so I could see relationships between individuals, both in Florida and Spain, and then other places in Latin America. But I think that's a really wise approach, which is that's another layer of information that we can see through visualization, and seems to, like, I think, really activate people's imagination and thought processes. Are there other questions that folks have? Or also, again, I leave this open in the sense of, if you're thinking about a project that you've been thinking about, and literally are asking yourself, how would I ever do X? This is always a great place to do that. Thanks, Jennifer. Please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your project. It's a lot to wrap my head around. So I'm a cataloger at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and we digitize manuscripts in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're going into further east into Asia now too. But I'm working on the back end of cleaning up our catalog information for Western European manuscripts that we microfilmed in the 60s and 90s. So there's a lot of data that we have and that is freely available. That would be really interesting to kind of compare with your model and what you're using. But also, I was most excited by the idea of absences, right? Because a lot of the objects that we've digitized and microfilmed and cataloged were built off of networks of, this monastery knew that monastery and recommended us, and it's kind of just exploded since then. But still based on those networks, the idea of finding where those absences are in those networks could be really useful. And
for hunting, hunting them down and all sorts of, very exciting. I've certainly, some of the archivists I've spoken to, like, they found LMMs very useful for example, someone I know has been assembling, I've forgotten the term, it's like the canonical name you give to any individual, and there'll be a bunch of synonyms, but actually kind of assembling those together. And they said that it was just kind of like magic, what it did. They had a Python script and they called the API and went through the names. But otherwise, I guess there are big issues about incorporating derived data into catalogs of, that human beings have said. That I find very interesting, and I hope we're going to talk more about it at the conference. So very welcome to everybody.
Yeah, what you're talking about with the standardizing names is like the other half of what we've been doing lately, is just trying to keep a consistent spelling and something that people can find, but then getting our authority file system and our searchable database, it's usable, but I don't think a lot of users know that they can make these two things talk to each other. So yeah.
That was it, authority names, yes.
Great. Any other last questions that we might have this afternoon? And I know some folks are just coming in right now. There's a time change that's different between the United States and Europe right now, and it may have caused some problems with folks joining at the right time. And that would have been my error, absolutely. So just want to acknowledge that this entire workshop is recorded, so I will be sharing that back out later on today, so that you can view it at your discretion. But any last questions or comments that folks might have about Stephen's work or working with these large language multimodal models for investigation? Yes, please, Anthony.
I'm just wondering whether what you think, Stephen, or whether that there is a possibility of doing something like the Kitab project for medieval Western manuscripts.
For sure, yeah. It's going to be, and of course they're coming to the conference, so it's going to be very exciting we're hoping to juxtapose people from looking at different areas of the sort of old world scriptome, to partly to see what they're doing and how we could, yeah, definitely.
Well, good. I'm going to share just right now, real quickly, just and you'll get a notice about this. This is just kind of a little warm up for us today, was to kind of introduce some of these ideas. But again, our conference that's coming up fairly soon is this ours conference, Creating the Pre-Modern, the Age of Large Multimodal Models. And this is really building upon the Dark Archives conferences that were hosted at Oxford twice already. And now we're continuing those. Thankfully, Dr. Le Pen will be hosting us out of Stockholm, and Stephen Pink out of Oxford. And just to kind of give you a flavor of what's coming, you can see is the first day will be a keynote on rethinking the past and AI perspective in archaeology. So we'll be thinking about material culture in that respect, and there will be some responses there. A second keynote will be related to pre-modern archives, and you can see some of these are kind of some of our notes as we're building, as we're going. And the last piece that I'll speak on is actually on using game worlds built with large language models to look at alternative explanations of history. And in fact, Dr. Francisco Garcia Serrano, who's in the meeting with us right now at St. Louis University in Madrid, we played a virtual reality game where students played Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain, and trying to manage basically civic relationships, religious interactions, to kind of see what was really happening. And one of the interesting things that kind of came out of that discussion really was that the students were identifying alternative explanations for what may have happened in history. And that poses an opportunity then to say, maybe we didn't consider this option, and now we can go back and look at the record and see, was another type of agreement made that was never recorded in history, but there might be signs of it in the archive that we had missed. So it's another way of actually thinking about it as an analytical engine of thinking about, I know how I think about history, and that's kind of boring, actually. What's interesting is how other people think about history and their explanations, and using those as ways to get at better explanations of what happened. And the last plug that I would like to do would be for our next upcoming workshop. And we have with us today Professor Andrea Davis, who's in the room, but she and our colleague Patricia will be doing one on digital storytelling in DH. And they'll be working around stories around the Spanish Civil War, so a more modern topic. But again, I think all of these are, these different DH approaches to like communicating this information to audiences in new and exciting ways. And I think, like a lot of us consider, as humanists, this is a fight for eyeballs and ears. And so we have to find ways to really reach the public, the students and colleagues in new ways, so that they're interested beyond maybe a traditional monograph, which we all love as well. So with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Pink for his presentation today. You'll get a follow-up email, and if there are any last comments or questions, please make those apparent now. If not, I'll close our meeting today. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have had a good morning, or you're going to have a good morning, and we'll see you around. Take care.
Thank you.